There's a specific kind of message that governments send when words have stopped working. Not a press release, not a diplomatic cable, not a statement read from a podium in front of flags, a transaction, a signed contract, a wire transfer, a delivery schedule for hardware that kills things. On February 26, 2026, hours before the deadline Donald Trump set himself for Iran to make a deal or face consequences, Iran sent that message. Tehran sealed a $500 million arms agreement with Moscow, and in doing so, answered every question about whether the Geneva talks were ever real with a single signed document. The timing was not accidental. Nothing about this transaction was accidental. Iran did not need to announce this deal publicly. Arms transactions between sanctioned nations happen quietly every day, deniably, through intermediaries, through shell companies in third countries. Iran chose to make this one visible. Iran chose to let it land in Western intelligence channels on the precise day the American deadline was expiring. That choice is the message. The message is not, we are buying weapons. The message is, we are buying weapons while your deadline expires, and we are making sure you know it. That is not desperation. That is confidence. The confidence has a specific source that changes every calculation that Washington has been making for the past 6 weeks. Let me show you what $500 million actually buys between Russia and Iran in February 2026, because the number matters less than the inventory. According to intelligence assessments and confirmed reporting from European security services, the deal encompasses 3 primary categories of military hardware. The first category is advanced air defense components. Russia's S-400 Triumph system is the platform Western military planners fear most in any Iran strike scenario. Iran already operates partial S-400 components. This deal accelerates the integration of full battery systems with the radar networks that Russian technical advisors have been building into Iranian air defense architecture since 2023. The S-400 can track targets at 600 kilometers, engage targets at 400 kilometers, simultaneously track 160 objects and engage 72 of them, including stealth aircraft. The B-2 Spirit bombers that conducted Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025. The F-22 Raptors that moved to RAF Lakenheath in February. The F-35 Lightning stealth fighters that arrived in the region this week. All of them become harder to operate when the S-400 battery network is fully integrated. Every day this hardware moves toward operational status is a day the strike option becomes more expensive in American pilots and aircraft. The second category in the $500 million deal is drone technology transfer. Not finished drones, technology transfer. The distinction is critical and almost entirely absent from mainstream coverage. Iran already manufactures its own Shahed series drones. The same family of drones Russia has used at scale in Ukraine. The same drones that demonstrated in 2024 that swarm attacks could overwhelm point defense systems designed for single-threat engagement. What Russia is transferring under this agreement is manufacturing process improvement, guidance system upgrades, seeker head technology that increases terminal accuracy from tens of meters to single-digit meters. Iran already builds these weapons. Russia is making them better. Better guidance means harder to intercept. Harder to intercept means higher probability of penetration against the Patriot batteries and THAAD systems, protecting American bases across the region. At Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, where 35 F-15E Strike Eagles have been repositioned, the 19 locations across 8 countries that Iran's UN letter formally declared legitimate targets on February 20th. The third category is the one that European intelligence services flagged as the most immediately alarming: anti-ship missile technology, specifically guidance and propulsion components for the next generation of Iranian anti-ship systems designed for Strait of Hormuz operations. Iran already operates the Noor and Qadr coastal defense missile systems, range covering most of the Persian Gulf, capable of targeting surface vessels, including warships. The USS Abraham Lincoln is positioned approximately 700 kilometers from Iranian territory in the Arabian Sea. The USS Gerald R. Ford arrived at Suda Bay in Crete on February 23rd, still closing distance. When both carriers reach operational position in the Arabian Sea, they will be the most powerful naval force assembled in the region since 2003. They will also be within range of Iranian anti-ship missile systems that Russia just agreed to make more accurate and more difficult to intercept. Supreme Leader Khamenei said the American carrier could be sunk, not threatened. Sunk. He said that before the $500 million deal was signed. Now let me show you what Russia gets from this transaction. Because arms deals between major powers are never one-directional. Russia is not selling $500 million in military hardware to Iran out of ideological solidarity. Russia is buying something. The first thing Russia is buying is battlefield data. Iran's proxy networks in Ukraine's neighborhood have provided Russia with irregular warfare intelligence for years, but what Moscow wants now is different. Russia wants the operational results of Iranian weapons performance against American and Israeli defense systems in the coming conflict. Every Shahed drone that penetrates American-based defenses or Israeli Iron Dome coverage generates data about seeker vulnerabilities, data about interception timing, data about electronic warfare effectiveness. That data flows back to Russian weapons designers who are building the next generation of systems for use against NATO in a potential European theater conflict. Iran is not just a customer. Iran is a live testing environment for Russian weapon systems against the world's most advanced defenses. The second thing Russia is buying is oil price elevation. Russia's federal budget requires crude oil at approximately $70 per barrel to balance. Brent crude was already above $70 this week on threat premium alone. A confirmed Iran conflict drives oil to $120, $130, potentially $150 per barrel under the Oxford Economics severe scenario. At $130 per barrel, Russia earns an additional $60 per barrel on every barrel it sells. Russia exports approximately 7 million barrels per day, despite sanctions. $60 additional per barrel times 7 million barrels per day equals $420 million per day in additional Russian oil revenue. $420 million per day times 365 days equals $153 billion per year in additional Russian oil revenue from an Iran conflict premium alone. Russia is paying $500 million for a transaction that could return $153 billion annually in elevated oil prices. That is a 3.6-to-1 return on investment if the conflict materializes and sustains. This is not an arms deal. This is the most leveraged geopolitical trade in the modern era. The third thing Russia is buying is American strategic distraction. Every carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf is a carrier strike group not in the Pacific. Every F-22 Raptor at RAF Lakenheath positioned for Iran operations is an F-22 Raptor not patrolling the Baltic approaches. Every B-2 bomber at abnormal readiness at Whiteman Air Force Base is a B-2 bomber not available for rapid deployment to European contingencies. Every Pentagon planning cycle consumed by Iran, strike authorization, retaliation assessment, and regional force protection is a planning cycle not devoted to NATO reinforcement, Taiwan contingency planning, or the European theater scenarios that Russian military planners have been developing since 2022. Vladimir Putin does not need Iran to defeat America. He needs America to look the other way for 18 months. The $500 million deal is the payment for that distraction. It is the most cost-effective strategic investment Russia has made since the Wagner Group's African operations established proxy influence at a fraction of conventional military cost. Now I need to show you the timeline of this deal because the timeline is more alarming than the deal itself. The negotiations for this agreement did not begin this week. European intelligence services with confirmed reporting and outlets including Reuters and Der Spiegel have been tracking the framework of this transaction since November 2025. November 2025 was 5 months before Trump's February deadline. 5 months before the carrier strike groups moved, 5 months before the B-2 bombers reached abnormal readiness, 5 months before the Beirut embassy was drawn down, Iran was negotiating this arms deal while simultaneously engaging in the indirect nuclear talks in Oman in October 2025, while attending the first Geneva round on February 6, 2026, while attending the second Geneva round on February 18th. While every American diplomat and military planner was focused on the nuclear negotiation track, Iran was building its military resilience track in parallel. The diplomatic engagement was not a good faith effort to reach a nuclear agreement. It was time purchased to complete a transaction. 60 days of diplomatic process allowed Iran to move from framework agreement to signed contract to initial delivery scheduling on $500 million in Russian military hardware. The Geneva talks were not the main event. They were the cover. The Chinese dimension of this deal is the layer that intelligence analysts are discussing in channels that have not yet reached public reporting. China did not sign this contract. China's name does not appear on any document. But the Chinese YC-8B UHF banned three-dimensional long-range anti-stealth surveillance radar that was deployed to Iran earlier this year does not operate in isolation from the Russian S-400 components arriving under this agreement. These systems are designed to be networked. Chinese radar detects the stealth aircraft. Russian S-400 engages it. The integration of Chinese surveillance technology with Russian engagement technology inside Iranian air defense architecture creates a layered system that no single Western nation designed its strike packages to defeat simultaneously. The B-2 Spirit's stealth capabilities were validated against Russian radar systems before Chinese anti-stealth technology was integrated into the same network. The F-35's radar cross-section was calculated against threat environments that predate the Chinese YC-8B deployment to Iran. Every American strike authorization briefing that includes an acceptable aircraft loss rate is now using assumptions that the $500 million deal just made more optimistic than reality. The European response to the signing of this deal tells you more about the current strategic reality than any statement from Washington. Germany, France, and the United Kingdom issued a joint statement on February 26th that described the arms transaction as a serious escalation threatening regional stability and international security. Serious escalation. Those two words from the three European powers who have been the most cautious voices throughout this crisis carry specific weight. These are the same governments that urged diplomatic resolution throughout the Geneva process. The same governments whose intelligence services have been sharing threat assessments with Washington. The same governments whose citizens are watching energy markets price an Iran conflict into their monthly fuel bills. When the European E3 calls something a serious escalation on the day an American nuclear deadline expires, they are not performing concern for diplomatic record. They are telling Washington that their own threat assessments have crossed a threshold. The threshold from manageable crisis to uncontrollable escalation. The Israeli response was more direct. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz stated publicly on February 26th that the arms deal proved Iran was not serious about diplomacy and was instead preparing for war. Preparing for war. From the defense minister of the country that provided Trump with a 73-target list inside Iran. The country whose Prime Minister Netanyahu argued at the White House last week that Iran has never been weaker, and the time is right for maximum pressure. Netanyahu travels to meet Secretary of State Marco Rubio on February 28th, 2 days from now. The conversation on the 28th changed the moment the $500 million deal was signed. Before the deal, Rubio was carrying a message about diplomatic progress and remaining gaps. After the deal, Rubio is carrying intelligence about Russian hardware delivery schedules and the specific capabilities those deliveries add to the Iranian air defense network that his B-2 bombers will need to penetrate. The visit on the 28th is no longer a diplomatic update briefing. It is a targeting conversation. Let me show you what the delivery timeline means operationally. Because hardware agreements have implementation schedules, and implementation schedules have military implications. Russian arms deliveries to Iran do not move through conventional shipping channels that Western navies can interdict. They move through the Caspian Sea corridor, the landlocked body of water that Iran and Russia share direct coastline access on, the corridor that no American naval asset can physically reach, the corridor that no Western sanction regime can physically block. The Caspian corridor was the route through which Russia delivered Tor M1 air defense systems to Iran in 2007, the route through which S-300 components moved in 2016, the route that has been used for every significant Russian military transfer to Iran for 20 years. It is open. It is functional. It is beyond the reach of any military option Washington is currently considering. Under the February 26th agreement, initial deliveries are scheduled to begin within 21 days. 21 days from February 26th is March 19th. Trump's deadline of 10 to 15 days from February 19th expires between March 1st and March 6th. The delivery timeline is designed to begin after the American deadline expires. Iran is not deterred by the deadline. Iran is scheduling hardware deliveries for the period after it. The oil market reacted to the signing of this deal before most financial journalists had read the full text. Brent crude jumped $4.20 per barrel in the 90 minutes following the first confirmed reports of the transaction, from above $70 to approaching $75 in 90 minutes on a signed contract announcement, before a single piece of hardware has moved. This is what $500 billion in global annual energy trade reacts to when the probability distribution of Strait of Hormuz disruption shifts. JP Morgan's $120 to $130 barrel scenario assumes a closure. It does not assume a closure in which Iranian air defense capabilities have been upgraded by Russian S-400 integration and drone guidance improvements in the weeks preceding the American strike. The upgraded scenario moves the closure probability higher because it moves the American strike risk calculation higher. Higher strike risk means higher probability of Iranian retaliation. Higher retaliation probability means higher probability of Hormuz interdiction. Higher Hormuz interdiction probability means higher oil price. Gold moves simultaneously from $5,000 toward $5,080 in the same 90-minute window. The VIX moved. Treasury yields moved. Markets were pricing the deal's implications faster than diplomatic statements were being drafted. Now I need to show you the specific problem this deal creates for the American strike authorization calculation. Because the military planning implications are not being discussed publicly, and they change the risk assessment in ways that the 90% kinetic action probability estimate may not fully incorporate. The June 2025 Operation Midnight Hammer deployed 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. It worked because Iranian air defense at that moment could not reliably track stealth aircraft. The Chinese YC-8B radar changed that partially. The Russian S-400 full battery integration changes it more completely. An American strike, authorized in March 2026 after initial Russian hardware deliveries begin, is not the same operational environment as June 2025. The aircraft are the same. The munitions are the same. The pilots are the same. The threat environment they fly into is materially different. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator weighs 30,000 pounds. It is designed specifically to destroy hardened underground facilities. The 14 weapons dropped in June 2025 damaged Fordo and Natanz. Neither facility was eliminated. Iran has been hardening both facilities continuously since June 2025. Concrete shields, tunnel reinforcement, deeper burial. The same weapon against a harder target produces less damage. More weapons are required to achieve the same effect. More sorties means more aircraft in Iranian airspace. More aircraft in Iranian airspace against improved air defense systems means higher aircraft loss rates. Higher aircraft loss rates means American pilots dead or captured. American pilots dead or captured changes the political calculation in Washington in ways that no financial model captures and no diplomatic off-ramp addresses. The proxy network activation risk multiplies with this deal in a specific way. Kataib, Hezbollah, and affiliated Iraqi militias have 5,000 fighters inside Iran as of January reporting. Hezbollah in Lebanon has stated it is not neutral. The Houthis in Yemen have demonstrated sustained Red Sea disruption capability. These networks do not require the $500 million deal to activate. They were ready before it was signed. What the deal does is change the confidence level with which Iran orders their activation. Before the deal, Iranian leadership was making retaliation calculations based on its existing capabilities against American bases and regional allies. After the deal, with improved air defense systems in the pipeline, with upgraded drone guidance reducing interception rates, with Russian technical advisors integrating the new systems into existing networks, the Iranian leadership's confidence in its ability to sustain a retaliatory posture improves. Improved confidence means lower threshold for proxy activation. Lower threshold means Hezbollah fires earlier. Kataib. Hezbollah strikes American bases in Iraq sooner. Houthis resume Red Sea attacks faster. The proxy war that runs parallel to the air campaign becomes more likely to develop its own momentum independent of whatever diplomatic channels remain open. The Watson Institute's $8 trillion calculation for 2 decades of American wars was built on proxy conflicts without this level of coordination, without Russian hardware backing the primary state actor, without Chinese surveillance technology integrated into the defensive architecture. The number that applies to the Iran scenario is not $8 trillion over 20 years. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session on February 26th. China requested the session. Russia co-sponsored the request. The stated purpose was to discuss the deteriorating situation regarding Iran's nuclear program and the threat of American military action. China's UN ambassador spoke for 23 minutes. The substance of those 23 minutes was directed at one audience, not the Security Council, not Iran, not Russia. The American domestic audience that watches UN coverage and forms opinions about whether their country is acting with international legitimacy or against it. China's ambassador cited the IMF's February 24th fiscal warning, cited the energy market disruption that American military action would trigger, cited the $500 million deal as evidence that confrontational American policy was driving Iran toward Russia and China rather than toward negotiated resolution. China used the UN podium to make the economic case against American military action that Trump's own advisors were making in private. The argument China made publicly is the argument that Trump's economic team is making internally, the argument that Reuters' confirmed advisors were urging to override the military instinct. China is not trying to stop the war out of concern for Iranian welfare. China is trying to stop the war because China imports 5.4 million barrels of crude oil per day through the Strait of Hormuz and cannot afford $130 oil, while simultaneously managing a domestic economy that the World Bank projects grows at 4.5% this year only if energy costs remain stable. China's UN speech was a self-interested economic intervention dressed in the language of international law, but the economic argument China was making was the same economic argument Trump's advisors were making, and that convergence is significant. The Russian corvette Stoki participated in joint naval exercises with Iranian vessels in the Sea of Oman on February 19th. 7 days later, Russia signs a $500 million arms deal with Iran on the day the American deadline expires. These are not unconnected events. The naval exercises were the public signal of the relationship. The arms deal is the substance of it. Russia is not going to intervene militarily if American strikes hit Iran. Everyone understands that. Russian military doctrine does not commit to conventional defense of non-treaty partners against nuclear-armed adversaries, but Russia does not need to intervene militarily to change the outcome. Russia needs to raise the cost of American military action high enough that the domestic political constraints inside the United States do the work that Russian military deterrence cannot. The $500 million deal raises strike risk. Strike risk raises casualty projections. Casualty projections enter the authorization briefing. The authorization briefing goes to a president whose own advisors are telling him the economic cost is already catastrophic. Russia is applying pressure through the American political system, through oil prices, through risk calculations, through the IMF projections and the Moody's downgrade threat and the midterm election arithmetic. It is the most sophisticated application of indirect pressure in Russian strategic history since the Cold War, and it cost $500 million. Steve Witkoff landed in Doha on February 26th for consultations with Qatari mediators, the same day the arms deal was signed. Witkoff is Trump's lead negotiator. The man who told Fox News the president could not understand why Iran had not moved to make a deal. He arrived in Doha to understand why. The answer he found was not the answer he brought to share. He brought a message about American seriousness and deadline proximity and the consequences of Iranian failure to engage constructively. He received a message about a $500 million Russian arms deal signed on the deadline day and an Iranian position that had not moved by a single meter on enrichment, on ballistic missiles, on proxy network support. Qatari mediators, who have hosted American military forces at Al Udeid and simultaneously maintained diplomatic relationships with Tehran, told Witkoff what they tell everyone who passes through Doha when the temperature reaches this level. Both sides are further apart than the public statements suggest. That sentence from Qatari mediators is diplomatic language, for the gap is structural and the timeline is running out. Witkoff left Doha without a framework agreement, without an Iranian written proposal meeting Washington's 4 deliverable requirements, without the concessions on enrichment that the American position requires. He left with the knowledge that Iran had just signed $500 million in Russian military hardware on the day his deadline expired. The specific clock that this deal resets is the targeting clock. American military planners have been developing strike packages against Iranian nuclear facilities since at least 2023. Those strike packages are built on intelligence assessments of Iranian air defense capabilities as of their last update. The $500 million deal does not immediately change Iranian air defense capabilities. It changed them on a timeline tied to Russian delivery schedules. Initial deliveries in 21 days. Full integration over 3 to 6 months, depending on Russian technical advisor deployment and Iranian operator training timelines. This creates a window that has a specific military logic. Strike before the hardware arrives, and you face the air defense environment of February 2026. Wait for diplomatic resolution that does not materialize, and you face the air defense environment of May or June 2026, after S-400 battery integration is complete. The targeting clock is now running in the opposite direction from the diplomatic clock. The more time the diplomacy consumes, the harder the targets get, and the more dangerous the airspace becomes. Every week of continued Geneva engagement that produces ambiguous language about guiding principles and remaining gaps is a week of Russian hardware, moving through the Caspian corridor toward Iranian air defense batteries. This is the trap that the $500 million deal sets. Not a military trap, a temporal trap. Force the choice between striking now against an incomplete but survivable air defense network or waiting for diplomacy that cannot close the structural gap while the air defense network completes its upgrade. The 4-country intelligence sharing network response to the signing of this deal happened within hours. United States, United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada, the Five Eyes minus New Zealand, issued a coordinated intelligence advisory on February 26th. The advisory described the transaction as part of a pattern of Russian-Iranian military cooperation that presents elevated risk to regional stability and international security. Pattern, not isolated transaction. The Five Eyes advisory was acknowledging what their collective intelligence had been tracking for months. The Shahed drone manufacturing technology transfer, the radar integration cooperation, the Caspian corridor logistics buildup, the Russian technical advisor presence at Iranian air defense sites. The $500 million deal is the financial formalization of a military relationship that has been operationally active for over a year. The advisory was not warning that something new was happening. It was confirming that something that had been happening quietly had now been signed publicly on the most symbolically loaded day possible. There is a historical parallel that nobody in current coverage is drawing, but that every serious strategist is thinking about privately. October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, 13 days between discovery and resolution. The mechanism of resolution was a secret agreement. Publicly, the Soviets withdrew missiles from Cuba. Secretly, the United States agreed to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey within 6 months. Both sides found a face-saving exit that allowed the retreat to be characterized as victory by each side's domestic audience. The parallel to February 2026 is not the missiles. It is the arms deal dimension. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet arms shipments to Cuba were the trigger. American quarantine of those shipments was the first escalatory American response. Soviet ships turning back from the quarantine line was the first de-escalatory signal. Iran signing a $500 million Russian arms deal on the day the American deadline expires is not Cuba receiving Soviet missiles, but it is a transaction that has the same structural function. It is the moment when one side demonstrates that it is receiving external military backing at the exact moment the other side is applying maximum pressure. The difference is that in 1962, Khrushchev blinked. In 2026, the arms deal suggests Iran is not blinking. And the question every analyst is asking right now is whether the American response to that signal is a quarantine or an authorization. The Lebanese-Hezbollah dimension of this deal has a specific operational implication. Hezbollah's Secretary General Naim Qassem stated in January the organization is not neutral. Hezbollah's arsenal of over 150,000 rockets and precision missiles survived the June 2025 campaign weakened but functional. The $500 million deal does not directly arm Hezbollah. Russian hardware goes to Iranian state military forces, but their relationship between Iranian state forces and Hezbollah is not transactional. It is structural. Iranian IRGC Quds. Force officers have been embedded in Hezbollah's command structure since the 1980s. Russian hardware that improves Iranian air defense capability frees Iranian resources. Resources that previously went to air defense procurement can be redirected. Some portion of redirected resources flows through Quds force channels to Hezbollah's precision missile program. The $500 million deal has a proxy network downstream effect that multiplies its direct military impact. The American embassy in Beirut was drawn down on February 23rd, 3 days before the deal was signed. The drawdown was precautionary based on intelligence available at that moment. That intelligence predated the deal's signing. The intelligence available after the signing is more alarming than what produced the drawdown. Trump's language on February 26th was the most closely watched output from any American official since the February 19th Board of Peace deadline announcement. He did not immediately escalate. He did not immediately characterize the arms deal as a red line crossing. He said he was aware of the reports and that his team was reviewing the situation. Reviewing, not responding, not threatening, not announcing consequences. Reviewing. That word landed in Tehran as confirmation that the blink of Tuesday, February 25th was structural rather than tactical. Reviewing is the language of a decision-maker who does not have a clear next move. Clear next moves produce clear language. Bad things happen. We will take care of it. Nobody wants to see what comes next. Reviewing is the language of a president who has been told by his military that the air defense upgrade in the pipeline changes the strike package risk calculation, and who has been told by his economic team that $130 oil destroys the midterm election, and who has been told by his intelligence team that the proxy network activation threshold just dropped. Reviewing is the language of someone looking for options, and not finding the clean ones that existed 6 weeks ago. The $500 million deal was signed hours before the American deadline expired. The deadline expired without military authorization being transmitted. The carriers are still in position. The jets are still in theater. The B-2s are still at abnormal readiness. The Beirut embassy is still drawn down. But the deadline passed, and the arms deal was signed. And the Russian hardware is scheduled to begin arriving in 21 days through a Caspian corridor that no American military asset can physically reach. The one Trump advisor, who said 90% probability of kinetic action in the next few weeks, gave that assessment before the arms deal was signed, before the S-400 integration timeline became a factor in the authorization briefing, before the strike package risk calculation incorporated the upgraded air defense environment, before the targeting clock started running in the opposite direction from the diplomatic clock. The 90% has not been publicly revised, but the calculation behind it is different this morning than it was when it was made. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, 3 kilometers across in each designated shipping lane, 20 million barrels of crude oil per day, 22% of global LNG trade. No viable alternative routing for 13.5 million of those 20 million daily barrels. The $500 million deal, signed on February 26, 2026, did not close those 3 kilometers. It did not lay a single mine. It did not fire a single missile. It did not stop a single tanker. It changed the probability that all of those things happen. Changed it in a direction that every oil futures trader, every war risk insurance underwriter, every shipping company routing team, and every central bank risk manager on Earth processed within 90 minutes. Brent crude toward $75, gold toward 5,000, and ODI, VIX elevated. Treasury yields falling as capital fled toward safety. These are not panic movements, they're probability adjustments. The probability of the event that sends oil to $130 and triggers the cascade that the IMF was already projecting, disrupts a 140% debt trajectory just got higher. Not because of the hardware in the deal, because of what the deal says about the decision-making inside Tehran. A government that signs a $500 million Russian arms deal on the day an American nuclear deadline expires is not a government that is preparing to make concessions. It is a government that has concluded that the deadline was a bluff, and governments that conclude American deadlines or bluffs do not become easier to deter after the deadline passes. They become harder, because the lesson they take from the deadline passing is the lesson that changes every future calculation. Maximum American military pressure. 2 carrier strike groups, 50 additional jets in 24 hours, B-2 bombers at abnormal readiness, 10-day deadline publicly announced, and Iran signed an arms deal with Russia on deadline day. That lesson is not lost on Tehran. It is not lost on Moscow. It is not lost on Beijing. It is not lost on Pyongyang. It is not lost on any government anywhere that has been watching to see whether American military pressure in 2026 produces a different outcome than American military pressure has produced before. The arms deal was signed. The deadline expired. The hardware is coming. And through the 3-kilometer shipping lane between Iranian coastline and Omani territorial waters, the tankers are still moving, carrying the assumption in their holds alongside the crude oil, the assumption that the system holds. That assumption has never been more expensively maintained and never more fragile.